Welcome to Doctors of the Baobab. On this podcast, we go beyond the white coat to get to know the doctors that we admire and respect. Join us today as we explore the stories behind the stethoscopes, uncovering the humanity behind the medical expertise. Whether it's navigating complexities of patient care, overcoming personal obstacles, or advocating for change in healthcare systems, each episode promises to inspire, educate, and uplift. So sit back, relax, and prepare to embark on a journey of discovery with Doctors of the Baobab. And in today's episode, I am so honored to welcome today's guest, a woman whose work is changing lives and shifting cultures. Dr. Maiysha Clairborne is a physician who's not only walked through burnout herself, but she's turned that journey into a mission to help others to heal, to lead, and to thrive. She's an integrative medicine doctor, a master hypnotherapist, neurolinguistic programming trainer, a founder of the Mind Remapping Company. And she spent over 20 years helping individuals and organizations to transform from the inside out. Whether she's working with corporate leaders, with clinicians, educators, her goal is the same: to create spaces where people feel seen, they feel heard, they feel valued, and they feel empowered. Dr. Maiysha is a TEDx speaker and a sought-after voice on stages across the US and around the world. Wherever she speaks, she brings a rare blend of neuroscience, emotional intelligence, lived experience, and soul. She also hosts the Black Mind Garden podcast, which is one of the fastest growing podcasts hosted by a Black woman, where she shares raw and reflective conversations about mindset, trauma, legacy, and the unconscious patterns that shape us, and how we break free to design lives that feel like home. Her presence is real, her insight is deep, and her impact is lasting. Please help me welcome the brilliant and deeply inspiring Dr. Maiysha Clairborne.
Well, first of all, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Nandamiso. I'm so excited to be here. First of all, I'm going to need you to send me that bio because I was like, well, I mean, my goodness.
And none of it is a lie. You know what? I get this often from doctors. And what is surprising to me is that it's the truth. I literally just take a composite of all your information and then I put it in ChatGPT and I say to ChatGPT, hype her up, because I know you're not going to do it for yourself.
Yeah, I'm gonna need you to go ahead and send me that so that I can read it and you know, this is the bio I'm gonna now send to other people.
So how does it feel knowing that this is you? I know this, working with doctors, we tend to be, as we discussed before, we don't like to put ourselves out there. I think the way that we're trained, the medical culture, it's not about self-promotion. But how does it make you feel, listening to your legacy and that kind of description of yourself?
It's somewhat undescribable, which is ironic given that I'm a communications person. But it really is. There's I have to like pause and be like, wow, I did all of that stuff. And it does make me feel like I'm contributing to the world. And that like the work, all of the education and the money that I've spent on this education, there's an impact happening. Just beautifully done. Thanks, ChatGPT. Shout out to you know, and to you. As you can see, I'm a little bit without words, mostly because I've never heard it in that way before.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And no, thank you for being that person. It makes it very easy, I think, even for ChatGPT. But I'd love to know and explore a little bit more about where this greatness comes from. And we always sort of start off, in your early journey, your early life, try to understand perhaps what was the influence in your early life that led you here. So if we can walk maybe through that timeline, maybe back and forth, but certainly starting at the beginning where you were born, and if you can speak to the circumstances that brought you here today.
Absolutely. Well, I'll start out by saying that I always say this when I talk about like my journey, my career journey, is my mom is the original OG entrepreneur in my life. And so, like, what I do now is a function of what I saw her do growing up. And so I'll share that I was born in Tucson, Arizona. I was probably there for all of about a couple of years. But my mother and my father, they met at Pima College in Tucson, and they were both pre-med or pre-med and pre-dental. And then they went on to Meharry Medical College in Nashville. And that's where my middle sister was born. They did split up early in my life. So we then moved to New York, which is where my father's from. And they were doing their residency. And it was during that time that they had split up, and then they tried to reconcile, and then they split up again. So from an early age, from a young age, my home was split up. And then we moved to Alabama, and that's where I grew up. So my mom, her second husband was abusive. And so I share, I grew up in an abusive, as a child witness to domestic violence. And so, during that time, for a period of probably, 10 years or so, we were in that circumstance. But what I saw happen was one day I came home, it was in the seventh grade, and I'll never forget. My mom checked me out of school, and I came home to the U-Haul truck. And it was probably like the day that I was one of the most relieving days of my life, as a young child, like, we're getting out of here. And that doesn't mean that, the after that was easy, because then my mom had to then struggle, even as a dentist. She had worked with the person who was her abuser, and she had to then start her own practice. So this is what I'm watching, right? I'm watching my mom, like, the strength of her to leave her abuser, to we lived in this one, like, 2-bedroom apartment on the mountain in Huntsville, Alabama, which is where I mostly grew up. And I shared a room with my two younger sisters, and then she had the other room. And sometimes my sisters would get on my nerves, and I'd actually go sleep on the couch. There was a pull-out couch. I remember that I would sometimes like sleep on the pull-out couch rather than sleep in the room with my sisters. But that was a tough time. I mean, I know I can't only imagine like the struggle that she had, understanding as a single mom now, like the single mom of one, she was a single mom of three, then going to start her own practice. And then I worked in her practice even as a young person. In the summertime, I would go up and I would like file things and, clean up the dental operatories after patients were done, and sterilize things. Like, I was working in the office, cleaning up, and from a very young age. And so, yeah, I mean, like, this is the start of me watching this woman who, I mean, if she were to listen to this, I know she would be puddles on the floor, because she doesn't know that I remember this. And this is the purview. And this is what I appreciate most, is like watching her and her strength to move and transition and start her own practice and build that practice up successfully, start a second location, sell the first location, and go on to just be this very successful dentist. And then meanwhile, my father, who was an OBGYN doctor, but after they split up, I didn't see him for some years, but he definitely kept in touch. He went the traditional route, got a job, worked as an OBGYN for however many years, and then retired. So he's a retired OBGYN doctor. And then somewhere along the way, my mom and my dad, they mended fences and became friends. And so now, my mom's remarried, my dad's remarried, but they're all like this just blended, beautiful blended family. And so it just is a testament to what healing can happen even after, which was a pretty caustic divorce.
Thank you for sharing that, and being I think these are not easy conversations to have, and I can understand also how you'd feel in terms of how your mother, might perceive this as a mother myself. And I'm wondering, as an African, Especially in my culture, when we have what we call a bag, of tools that gets passed down from one traditional healer to their child, right? So if your parent was, for example, a medical person like yourself, you've inherited that gift, right? So we call it that bag of tools.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering to what extent, the influence from both your parents being in the medical field was, or is that something that just came from you to follow that path?
Well, I mean, I would like to say that it was my idea, but let's be real. I'm sure there was some, subconscious, like I knew my dad was a doctor, and my mom's a dentist. Now, I will say one thing: as a child who grew up first as a receptionist slash back office person, but then coming up and starting to be a dental assistant. I learned to be a dental assistant as a teenager. And I knew, I was like, well, dentistry is not the one for me. Like, I just knew I wasn't going to be a dentist. Then when I started to visit my father, and he would be so proud to bring me to work and come in and see these patients with me and then come be on call with me and be in the operating room with me. And this is like, by this time, I was like high school, college. I was like, yeah, definitely not gonna be a way in. So, but I think that was in my DNA to an extent in terms of the influence. I think my mother had a very significant influence on me becoming an entrepreneur and deciding to, even before I left clinical medicine, I had my own practice. And so, I knew very early on that I was not probably going to go the traditional route as a physician, which is to get a job in a hospital or in a clinic, because I had seen my mom and the freedom that came with her, owning her own business. Even through the struggle, there was this like ownership, this autonomy. That's the word I want to use. So, and then I also saw my dad working like, 80, 100-hour weeks. And I was like, yeah, maybe more my mom did on this one. But then my dad, he had this stability that has this stability factor because he's still with us. Both my mom and my dad are still alive. He has this like stability factor. And I think I got the best of both of my parents. Like I really did. He has this equanimity about him, and he was very wise with money. And so he taught me, my mom, not so much. She's a little bit more of a thrift. And I got a little bit of a, emotionality with money. But my dad taught me about investing and about saving and about preparing for the future, which is something my mom didn't teach me. So like I think that in all of these still live with me in what I teach my son. Like we are listening to, as we record this, we're listening to The Psychology of Money on the way to school every morning. And my son is interested, man. He's leaning in.
Nice. I think we have such a big responsibility as parents to teach our children. And money, and I know certainly in the medical community, that's not something we feel even comfortable to talk about. I think even society doesn't really give us grace to talk about money. So it's really wonderful to learn about how your parents gave you a full view, of money and the importance of money in different ways, as you've said. So we've talked about sort of this bag, which is the professional bag. But you also mentioned earlier that there were some challenges in the home, and I'm wondering what bag you inherited from that you took forward, and maybe that's impacting you now or
Yeah.
impacted you going forward.
Well, I think that obviously growing up in a home of violence is a lot of trauma. And what I came to recognize, just I would say later, is that trauma didn't start with my mom marrying this abusive person, that she grew up in an abusive home herself. And I think, we all know that hurt people hurt people. And so the relationship between me and my mom, even after she left her abuser, and then when she remarried, not her current husband, but the husband before that, was, I would say, more psychologically abusive. And so the relationship between my mom and I became very strained because I think with not only her upbringing, but the experiences that she had, there was a lot of trauma that she passed on to us in different ways, right? And so I think that's part of what I inherited was this sort of like I didn't feel safe, and I know she never felt safe, and then just this broken kind of fractured relationship until it wasn't. Like, there was one of the things I was sharing earlier with a friend is that as I think about the cycles that I'm breaking, one is a sort of a money cycle, just a cycle of scarcity and a cycle of mismanagement of money that I think I inherited from my mom. Um, and also a cycle of trauma and abuse. Because I mean, in a lot of ways, my mom was abusive, less so physically, more so emotionally, psychologically. And so, and not, obviously not intentionally, but it was just her sort of coping with the circumstances that she was dealing with. And so now recognizing that as an adult child, I think I inherited some of that as a Gen X, as a Generation X parent. And I've been working very, very hard to break that cycle. Yeah. So
Mm-hmm.
it is interesting though, because, there are some things that I still bring forward. Like the other day, one of the things that our parents say is, I'm not one of your little friends.
That
I don't know if there's an equivalent saying in your culture. I don't know if there's like an equivalent saying, but like we say,
I'm
look,
not your age mate. Yeah.
right. So
Yeah.
yeah, our mom was like, I don't know who you're talking to. I'm not one of your little friends.
Mhm.
So, that's one of the things that with my son being 10 now and him being like 10 and a half, so almost 11. So he's getting that, he's feeling himself, he's getting a little preteen, energy. And so sometimes he likes to be a little chatty. And so sometimes I say to him, listen, I may be friendly and I may play with you, but just understand I am not one of your little friends. So there are some things that I do like to bring forward, but then there are some things that I, like absolutely allow him to challenge me. And if my behavior is, like when he said, if I raise my voice, which I'm working on, not perfect, but I do a lot better job of. But if I do, he'll say, well, that hurt my feelings when. I could never say something like that to my mom, right? It was just suck it up, buttercup, right?
Mm-hmm.
But like these are the things that I'm allowing him to do that I wasn't allowed to do with my mom. So it's like that walking that line of setting boundaries, but like allowing for voice.
Yeah. And I love that you are intentional in your parenting and recognize the patterns and the cycle that you want to break so that you're giving your son a different bag to inherit. I'm just wondering about when that recognition came that there is a cycle here, that, and the understanding that this is not a cycle that I want to pass on. I'm assuming there was a lot of work that you had to do yourself, between yourself and your mother, just to get to a point of being able to say, this is how I now want to move forward as a parent. For maybe somebody who's listening out there, who might have a story or recognize parts of themselves or their own history in what you're sharing, how would you advise them to have that awareness that this
Yeah.
is a cycle that needs to be broken?
Well, I'll share a little bit about how I became aware, and then I'll share like, what is it that I recommend. So for context, I'll share my age. I'm 50. And so I didn't, and so this will make sense. I didn't actually recognize that I was a trauma survivor until I was in my late 30s. So that just gives you the little bit of time, that it's been. And it was on accident. I was at lunch with a girlfriend who was a PhD therapist, and we were just talking, and then I must have said something. And then she asked, hey, are you a trauma survivor? And I said, no, I'm not. I said, my mom is a trauma survivor. She was a victim of domestic violence. And she said, well, did you grow up in the home with her? And I said, yeah. And she was like, you're a trauma survivor. So that was the first moment that I even recognized that I was impacted by trauma, which is very strange to me now looking back on it. But now I can understand because I had a different context of trauma, trauma being something that happened to the person, but I had no context for secondary and vicarious trauma, trauma that's experienced by those close by us, right? So that was the first time I realized it, that I was impacted by trauma. And that was I think that was after my divorce. So I was married, just to give you a little bit of timeline. I got married in 2007 for about 8 months. I was dating a guy who was an alcoholic addict, and he went into recovery. And we went across the world to New Zealand together from where I worked for 6 months. We came back, he proposed. We got married, he relapsed. There were some other things that he was doing that I was like, nah, this is probably not going to work. And then we got divorced. So when all of that happened within the marriage and divorce all happened within a year span. So that I recognized as a pattern. My mom having married a person who was an addict and who was abusive. So that was the first set of work I started to do. Um, I think that when I got pregnant with my son in 2014, 2013, that is, I no 2014, sorry. That's when I became a little bit more vigilant. Like, okay, I don't want to pass the cycle on to this my son. Like understanding all of the things that I had been through. And then after he was born, probably around the age of 4 was the next time that I sort of realized that some of my isms from my mom were coming up in the way I was parenting. And so for me, it was therapy. That was it for me. And we don't talk a lot about, therapy has a stigma in our culture. And so my mom didn't come up having therapy. My dad didn't come up having therapy. I mean, they were just like, oh, well, just be strong, or oh, you got this, or oh, don't worry. Well-meaning parents, but like not great, right? And even jumping back into residency, this was when I was younger, when I was like suffering from major depressive disorder and contemplating suicide, and called my parent to say, I'm not doing well. I was like, just be strong. Just got to be strong through this time. And that's just, wasn't the exact thing that I needed to hear, but it was, what was the context that she was operating from. So all of that to say, there were several moments of recognition. I think having my son was probably the biggest thing, and the parenting is probably the biggest thing that put the fire under my feet to really do some deeper work. And that work came through therapy. So, what I would say to people out there is that, just recognizing, to my colleagues, is that recognizing that really we are all impacted by trauma of some sort at some time in our lives. And it may be that we don't even recognize, which the trauma is so normalized in our culture and in our society that we don't recognize it as such. And sometimes it feels scary to like look at that and dig deep, especially if you're a busy professional and you have to support a family, because who has time to feel?
Mm.
Right? You got things to do. Like this was all me, right? And one of the things I was always afraid of is if I ever dug deep enough, like I would start to cry and never be able to stop. Like I wouldn't be able to survive that kind of like the depth of pain that I was experience. But really, our brains are designed to heal, and our bodies are designed to heal. And oftentimes the brain doesn't like rush it all in one fell swoop. Like it just sort of drips it. When the brain knows when you're ready, the unconscious mind knows when you're ready, and it allows you to process and then process and then process. But I just recommend processing with someone else, a trained therapist, or even a trauma-informed coach, right? So like the work that you do, I think is really important because there's healing in that work. Um, that's what I would recommend, is just reflect and know that we're all impacted, and be brave and courageous enough to do this work with someone who's trained to do this work.
Thank you for that. I'm noting as you talk about your experience, there is so much empathy that you bring forward, as you talk about both your parents, even there's no judgment, there's so much compassion that you're also bringing into the story. And these are all qualities that we yearn for in a doctor, right? In a physician. This is what we want in a physician. And I'm just wondering, what kind of physician are you? Is that an accurate assessment to say that these are the qualities that you bring to your medical career?
I would say yes. I would say yes. Now, I will say I was not always empathetic to my parents. I had to go through stages. Like, I was very angry with my mom for a time, and I was very angry with my dad for a time. I think, just age and wisdom and therapy has helped me to, and even the work that I do, the work that I do in trauma and bringing to others helps me to better understand oh, my parents were living during a time when, and like now having conversations with them and understanding, oh, this was what they were dealing with. They didn't have the luxury of being in therapy or of being emotionally intelligent. That wasn't a thing, they were just trying to survive. And so, like, understanding the circumstances, and especially like when my mom and my dad grew up, during the civil rights era, and then you go back just another stone's throw of a generation or two, and you've got slavery, right? And then you think about, okay, what's the generational trauma that gets passed down? And so, like, starting to understand that has helped me. But I think that I've always sort of, like, I'm my oldest child. I like to take care of people. I think I've always had that kind of like big heart. I've always brought that to the patients. I love relationships. I build relationships with my patients, and now working with organizations, when I work with leaders that want to connect me into their organizations, like I always tell them straight up, like, I'm a family doctor and I may not be in clinical medicine anymore, but I certainly still am a relationships girl. So this relationship, you're not going to get rid of me easily. Right? And I think that's sort of something that I've always brought.
Yeah. No, I can definitely attest to that. It's outside the scope of this podcast, but I've definitely witnessed how you build relationships. You really have this knack. It seems to come very easily for you to connect with people. But I'd love to hear a little bit more about the work that you do, because it also seems very diverse and quite a wide range of offers and assistance that you help individuals with, but also with organizations. Beside the speaking, which we'll talk about as well. So, if you can just share what kind of help do you offer individuals and organizations?
Sure. So when I work with individuals, I work with most individuals as a coach, and I do deep trauma release work with most of my clients. And it's typically in the context of, it can be in the context of career. A lot of times it's either career or family. Something's going on. They know that there's something under the surface, and they are in therapy or done therapy, but they want that deeper unconscious mind work. And that's a lot of the work that I do with individuals. And I primarily, like you, work with physicians, clinicians, sometimes nurse practitioners, sometimes PAs, and then healthcare leaders and things of that nature. The way that the work that I do personally maps into organizations is through leadership. And so I teach about trust and safety and communication inside of organizations. Essentially, I feel like we have lost the empathetic communication, the human interaction that's workable, that has people feel seen and heard and respected and valued. And so I bring very specific communication tools, because what I find is people know kind of what's supposed to happen, but they don't have the language or the listening. And so I just teach people different ways to listen and different language frames to interact with people and empower people, but also to advocate for oneself, to set boundaries, to call out unacceptable behaviors. So both sides of that. And then the third arm is that because I am a coach. I am also a coach trainer. And so because people know that a lot of times they've asked me to train them. So I actually have a coach training program as well.
Okay, could you tell us a bit more? I'm curious about the coach training program.
So my background is neurolinguistic programming, and it's a neuroscience-based communication and a neuroscience-based coaching. And so I actually train people in NLP coaching, and I train people in hypnosis and an NLP technique called timeline therapy, which helps people release negative emotions and limiting beliefs at their source.
Sounds very rich. I know before we started our recording, we talked about your speaking career as well. What are the types of topics that you cover when you speak?
The types of topics that I cover are similar to the type of work that I do. So I talk about trauma. I actually do talk about trauma in organizations and the impact of trauma on our communication and our listening. I talk about psychological safety and trust. And then I talk about like just communication that cultivates trust in general. So those are probably I think of it, those are the primary things that I talk about in some combination or another.
Sounds good. Now, I did a little bit of prying, or let's call it research, before I started the recording, and I went to your TikTok account, and from one 50-year-old to another, from one Gen X to you are very, very flexible.
Yes.
So tell me a bit more about your yoga, because I saw, oh my goodness, it was so impressive. But wow, I felt bad actually
Oh no.
as a 50-year-old, but I'd love to hear more about how you keep fit, your practices around spirituality and fitness for other 50-year-olds.
Well, I will say that I have been practicing yoga for almost 20 years, almost 20 years. So that's how I became flexible. Yoga is something that, so I actually started practicing, I would say that I practiced the style that I practice for about 20 years, but I've been practicing yoga for over 20 years.
Wow.
And it started because I've always been sort of very active and into sports and working out. And when I was in residency, I hurt my knee and I had to have surgery. And so yoga was kind of part of my rehab. But then what I noticed is that it also gave me a little bit of mental health zen as well. And so that's what kind of led me into it. And it has actually become a part of my spirituality because just in spiritual principle, there's a lot of, like letting go and surrendering and trusting and being present and being in the body. And so that has kind of flowed into my life. So yoga has become more than just a physical practice. It's become a mind grounding practice, mental strength practice, and it's also become a spiritual practice. And I'll tell you that there are days, when I'm stressed, and I'm part of a whole community too, which is um, that's pretty major. And so there are times when if I'm really stressed and I'm holding the stress and I don't realize it, that I will go in and I'll start my practice, and it'll cause an emotional catharsis, and I will just cry on the mat. And like it's normalized in our community and accepted. And my yoga instructor, who I've known for the entire time that I've been practicing, will come and she'll just, are you okay? Or she'll like come give me a hug, and like that's become part of the spiritual foundation, you know. And then I do have my own personal relationship with God, whom I call higher power, and I meditate every day and give gratitude for all the things that I have in the face of the world, and even in the face of personal challenges I might be facing. So I use gratitude as a spiritual practice, gratitude as prayer as well for me. And then, me and God, we like friends. So I just be randomly talking to God, be like, listen. And I do have a spiritual community that I attend, but like mostly I feel like I'm responsible for my spiritual path and my spiritual guide, and for passing that spiritual practice on to my son. So I take it very personally.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I must say I was quite impressed. So I feel kind of better that it's 20 years of practice in the making, because I felt like, wow, maybe should I be doing that? It sounds good. And I'm wondering, what are you grateful for?
Oh man, so much. Well, first of all, I am grateful to have such an amazing family and son. I am grateful to be able to do what I love with autonomy and flexibility and to be able to make the impact that I make. Um, I am grateful for amazing community, like people like you who I can have these conversations with, who I can, who kind of like shine a mirror and remind me of who I am. And I will say that for a very long time in my life, I didn't have that. I didn't have it. And so I'm very grateful to have that now, to have those relationships now, and to be, what's the word? To recognize the strength of vulnerability, to be able to lean on those communities. I'm grateful to be financially stable, and to be cultivating abundance. Yeah, I mean, just man, I'm grateful for my medical background, my degree, for the work that I've done, even though I'm no longer in clinical practice. Like, it has informed. As strange as it may sound, I am grateful for everything that I have experienced, even the bad, even the hard, even the traumatic, because it gives me who I am, to be able to tell my story and to be able to have the empathy for others and have a listening. So I'm actually grateful for all of it. Like, there's very few things in my life that I regret. There's a couple things, like I made this really bad purchase when I was in practice, and I was like, man, I wish I hadn't done that. But other than that, yeah.
No, thank you for that. And listening to that, as well as, thinking about your achievements and how we described it earlier on. By all accounts, the word successful comes to mind. And I'm curious about how you define success for yourself.
Well, that is evolving, if I were to be honest, because I will say that for a long time, and I mean, even up until recently, I defined success for financially. Like, I've defined it as, making a certain amount of money, or like not so much making a certain amount of money, but having a certain amount of financial freedom, not necessarily wealth, but freedom, which, I'm still working on the freedom part. But I think throughout these conversations that I have, I'm realizing that, like, I have like mommy success and I have this career success. Like, man, when I heard that bio, I was like, oh yeah, I guess I am successful.
Yes, you are.
I think success can be context dependent. So I think that there are levels of success that I could probably define, and for the most part I feel like that I've achieved a lot of those, for pretty good for a 50-year-old, and I just realize, I recognize, like, in my own career, I'm right in the middle of it. I'm not even close to done, in a lot of ways I'm just getting started.
Yeah. And when you get to 50, you say life begins at 50.
Right. Right.
It really does feel like every day presents an opportunity to be successful. And it's clear to me that you have that mindset. You live in that mindset of gratitude, curiosity, of care, of compassion, commitment to action, all of the Ubuntu principles, that's what I'm calling out now. You can see the evidence of that, of somebody who builds connection with other people. Dr. Maiysha, would that be a good place for us to end our conversation?
Yes, I mean, whew, I feel like we covered so much, and it's been an honor to be able to share with you in this way. These kind of conversations are not common, and they are very reflective of, they're just reflective. Like, I'm going to be reflecting on this conversation probably for the rest of the day.
I'm happy it found a home. And I'm wondering if there's just one thing you would like to say, maybe just some pearls of wisdom or something to live by, word of the day.
What comes to mind is that it's always a good time to heal. It's always a good time to heal, and it's always a good time to start anew. Whatever you're doing, whether it's parenting, whether it's career, whether it's relationships, it's always a good time to heal. it's always a good time to start anew, and you can always break cycles at any given time.
It's never too late to break that cycle. Thank you. Dr. Maiysha, it's been wonderful talking to you. And I'm sure our audience as well will enjoy talking to you as much as I have, not even just for this podcast, but from before as well. And thank you so much for the important work that you do in helping people to break cycles, conscious and unconscious cycles, because I think that is where the legacy comes in, and that's what we are all after. We want to make an impact and to leave a legacy, not only for our families, but in our work as well. And I think you're definitely doing a fabulous job of that. Dr. Clairborne, thank you so much for coming through.
Thank you so much for having me and for allowing me to share my story.